December 17th, 1944. The snow in the Ardennes Forest fell in heavy, suffocating silence, muffling the cries of men who no longer felt their fingers. Under the white cover, German infantry of the 277th Volksgrenadier Division huddled in shallow foxholes, frostbitten, starving, and terrified. For 10 straight days, the sky above them never went silent. The thunder of American artillery shook the frozen ground day and night, transforming the forest into a howling inferno of splintered trees and shattered bodies. The shelling was so relentless that even veteran soldiers began to lose their grip on sanity. Diaries recovered from the field spoke of men screaming in their sleep, of eardrums bursting, of comrades digging into the icy soil as if they could bury themselves away from death. Across the line, the U.S. 2nd Infantry Division and elements of the 99th were executing a continuous fire mission, the kind that erased entire coordinates from maps. American spotters in church towers and wooded ridges called in shells with mechanical precision, guided by the eerie glow of illumination flares. There was no rhythm, no pause, only the ceaseless thunder, meant not just to kill, but to break minds. In those days, the German front wasn't merely collapsing, it was being pulverized out of existence. Reports from Wehrmacht command described it as Höllenmaschine, the machine of hell. When dawn broke on the 5th day, nothing moved between the trees except smoke and crows. The forest floor had turned into a graveyard of blackened stumps and frozen corpses. Soldiers trapped in the chaos could no longer hear orders. Their world had shrunk to vibration and terror. Many tried to crawl out through shell holes, only to vanish beneath fresh bombardments. The wounded, unable to move, froze where they lay. Command posts lost contact, runners disappeared, and radio operators whispered Finautien, coordinates before shells tore through their positions. In the after-action reports, American officers later admitted they'd never seen anything like it. The shelling had continued without interruption for 240 hours, more than 600,000 rounds fired into a stretch of forest barely 3 miles wide. What was left of the German battalions was not a fighting force, but fragments of men wandering through mist and snow, deaf, disoriented, and broken, survivors of 10 days when the sky itself became their enemy. When the shelling finally stopped, the silence felt unnatural, as if the world itself had stopped breathing. Smoke drifted through the trees, mixing with the smell of frozen flesh and cordite. In that silence, the surviving German troops realized they were completely cut off. Supply lines had collapsed under constant bombardment. Every road leading east towards St. Vith was cratered beyond recognition, littered with overturned trucks, burned half-tracks, and twisted metal that once carried ammunition and food. Horses lay dead in their harnesses, their bodies rigid in the frost. The radio operators tried to raise command, but static was all that came through. The American guns had not only destroyed the landscape, they had destroyed communication, command, and hope itself. Within the shattered units, field officers tried to restore order. Captain Karl Hoffmann, commanding a company of Volksgrenadiers, wrote in his journal that his men no longer feared death, only the sound. They had stopped talking, stopped eating. Every burst of distant artillery sent them diving instinctively to the ground, even when the shells were miles away. Frostbite had turned fingers black, and the wounded moaned quietly beneath makeshift tarps. The trees that once offered cover now stood like jagged spears, stripped bare by shrapnel. For the Germans still trapped in those woods, every hour was a battle not against the Americans, but against time, hunger, and despair. American patrols began to move in cautiously, unsure if anyone was still alive beyond the smoke. They found scenes that defied imagination. Soldiers frozen mid-crawl, rifles still clutched in their hands, their eyes open but sightless. In one hollow, an entire gun crew was found around their artillery piece, encased in snow as if captured in the final moment of their lives. The infantry who discovered them didn't speak, they simply marked the position and moved on. War had turned the forest into a crypt. At night, the temperature fell below -15. Fires were forbidden. Their glow could draw American gunners still watching from the ridgelines. Some men tried to light cigarettes with trembling hands, the embers briefly illuminating hollow faces before being crushed into the snow. In a war built on movement, conquest, and strategy, this place had become something different, a frozen circle of hell where the line between soldier and victim blurred into the white silence of the Ardennes. By the 7th day, the trapped German regiments had no more rations, no morphine, and almost no ammunition. What little food remained had frozen solid inside their packs. Soldiers broke icicles from tree branches to suck for water. The wounded begged for help that could not come, their bodies stiffening in the cold as medics, now out of supplies, covered them with their own coats. The once disciplined German formations had dissolved into scattered clusters of survivors, each clutching their rifles as if they were the last tether to sanity. No reinforcements, no orders, no hope, only the memory of the opening days of the Ardennes offensive, when Hitler had promised a glorious counterattack that would split the Allied front in two. That promise now lay buried under 10 days of unending fire. Deep beneath the frozen ground, in half-collapsed bunkers, officers studied maps lit by the faint blue glow of lanterns. Lines that once marked their positions were gone. American artillery had erased them, turning the battlefield into something unrecognizable. Messages from higher command, if they came at all, arrived hours too late. "Hold your ground," the orders read. But the ground itself was gone. Even seasoned veterans of the Eastern Front said they had never seen destruction like this. Not even the Red Army's barrages compared to the precision and relentlessness of American firepower in the Ardennes. At dawn, snow began to fall again, covering the corpses and craters. The forest appeared peaceful for the first time in days, a cruel disguise over the nightmare beneath. Crows circled overhead, their cries echoing across the empty valleys. Somewhere beyond the fog, American gunners prepared for another round, their coordinates locked onto the last German resistance pockets. Each shell that landed carried not just destruction, but a psychological weight, the message that there would be no escape. In the ruins of a farmhouse near Krinkelt, a group of German survivors gathered around a single candle. One of them, a 20-year-old private from Hamburg, scribbled his final note into a blood-stained notebook. "The earth shakes without end. We no longer see the enemy, only the fire. If this is victory for them, then God must have left this place." The note was found weeks later by American troops clearing the forest. The private's body was frozen beside the wall, still clutching his helmet, as if waiting for the next barrage to fall. When the American lines finally advanced, they moved through a landscape that no longer resembled Earth. The forest was stripped to skeletons, blackened trunks, smoldering roots, snow stained with ash and blood. The men of the 2nd Infantry Division advanced cautiously, rifles raised, stepping over shattered helmets and frozen bodies. The silence that followed the barrage was heavier than the thunder that came before. It was not victory they walked into. It was desolation. Not a single German defensive line remained intact. Positions that once bristled with machine guns were now silent pits filled with debris. The artillery had done what bombs and bullets rarely could. It had erased the very idea of resistance. Behind the lines, American engineers worked tirelessly, clearing mines and cutting paths through the ruin. They found destroyed Panzer IVs still smoking, their crews entombed inside, their steel hulls twisted from the pressure of direct hits. Field medics discovered wounded men, German and American alike, lying side by side in the frozen muck, too weak to speak, too cold to move. Some clutched letters, others photographs of families that would never see them again. The war here had stripped away ideology. What remained were men trapped in the machinery of annihilation. Among the American ranks, whispers spread about what the Germans had endured, 10 days of fire without pause. Officers described it as the most concentrated artillery barrage ever executed by U.S. forces in Europe. Over 500,000 shells fired into a confined zone. It wasn't merely an assault, it was psychological warfare on a biblical scale. The gunners themselves admitted that after the first few days, the sound became unbearable even miles behind the lines. The ground shook without rest. Sleep was impossible. Men began to lose count of the days. One lieutenant would later write that even the forest seemed to scream. And beneath that forest, in shallow graves and collapsed shelters, the remains of the 277th Volksgrenadier Division lay where they had fallen. Their commanding officer, Colonel Wilhelm Wiebig, had tried to rally them until the very end, sending out desperate messages for relief that never came. His final transmission, intercepted by U.S. Signal Corps, read only, "All positions destroyed. No movement possible. We are finished." By the time the Americans reached his sector, nothing was left but wreckage and the echo of a division that had been wiped from the map, not by bullets, but by the unending storm of artillery that never stopped. The survivors who were eventually captured emerged from the forest like ghosts. Their faces were gray, their uniforms stiff with frost and filth. Many were half deaf, their eardrums shattered by concussion waves. Some had gone mute, eyes staring blankly as if still listening to the echoes of the shells. American medics who treated them wrote that these men did not react like prisoners, they reacted like the walking dead. When food was offered, they ate without chewing, hands trembling. When asked for names, many could not remember. The artillery had not only destroyed their bodies, it had erased the memory of who they once were. Among the prisoners was a sergeant from the 989th Regiment who had kept a diary throughout the bombardment, writing by the light of a burning ammunition box. His words, later found by U.S. intelligence, described the terror in meticulous detail. "The ground moves like a living thing. Every second we expect death. There is no air, only noise. We have no officers left. Only the sky and the fire remain." When questioned, he spoke softly of men losing their minds, shooting themselves just to stop the sound. For American interrogators, hardened by years of war, it was a glimpse into something beyond strategy, an experience that defied the logic of battle. As the U.S. advance pressed forward, the ruined forest became a field laboratory for psychological warfare analysis. Army intelligence teams documented the effects of prolonged bombardment on morale and perception. Reports concluded that no organized human resistance could survive continuous shelling of such intensity for more than 5 days. Yet the Germans had endured twice that. The result was not surrender, but mental collapse. The findings would later shape Cold War doctrines on psychological endurance, showing that even elite troops could be destroyed from within without ever being directly engaged. By the time the shelling ended, entire German units had simply ceased to exist in military records. Their names were crossed out, replaced by blank lines on division charts. The Ardennes had become a tomb for those who were ordered to hold at all costs. The snow buried the evidence quickly, concealing mass graves, broken artillery, and the wreckage of human willpower. When spring came months later, villagers returning to the area would find helmets, dog tags, and fragments of bones surfacing from the thawing ground. Silent witnesses to 10 days when war forgot all restraint and turned men into echoes beneath the trees. In the ruins of the Ardennes, the aftermath was studied by both sides with grim fascination. American officers had seen devastation before, from Normandy's beaches to the Ardennes Forest, but never like this. Entire sections of terrain had been reshaped, hills flattened, forests erased, and streams diverted by the relentless pounding. The artillery campaign was later referred to in confidential briefings as Operation Black Snow, a codename rarely spoken outside closed rooms. Its true scale remained classified for decades. Historians would later uncover fragments of the operation's records, revealing that U.S. divisions had coordinated over 30 separate artillery battalions to fire in overlapping shifts, ensuring that not a single minute passed without shells in the air. In the German archives, what little survived told the other half of the story. Reports from the remnants of the 277th and 12th Volksgrenadier Divisions described panic spreading through the ranks as communication lines failed. One message, intercepted but never fully decoded during the war, read, "We are under the hammer of God." Those who managed to escape through the woods spoke of madness, of men clawing at their helmets, bleeding from their ears, or laughing hysterically under fire. The German High Command had ordered them to hold the line near Rocherath-Krinkelt to delay the American counteroffensive, but after 10 days, there was no line left to hold. The front had dissolved into chaos. American intelligence officers who entered the region recorded bizarre details. Watches stopped at the same hour, perhaps from concussion waves, frozen corpses arranged in unnatural positions as if thrown by invisible hands, entire gun crews sitting upright, faces untouched, but lifeless. Some soldiers whispered about the forest of echoes, where even after the guns went silent, the sound seemed to linger in the air. Locals returning months later claimed they could still hear faint rumbling in the earth after dark. In Washington, military analysts studying the bombardment called it an unintended experiment in sustained psychological firepower. It revealed something chilling, that the human mind could be annihilated faster than the body. Commanders noted that artillery, not tanks or air power, had become the decisive weapon of the Western Front's final phase. The destruction in the Ardennes proved that no defense, no fortification, and no will could withstand the constant rhythm of mechanical thunder. 10 days of fire had rewritten the boundaries of human endurance, leaving behind not soldiers or heroes, but the hollow silence of a war that consumed everything, even sound itself. In the weeks that followed, as Allied forces pushed deeper into the Ardennes, the full horror of the bombardment came into focus. What the artillery had not destroyed, winter had claimed. Entire German platoons were found encased in ice, their faces preserved in expressions of shock and disbelief. Ammunition crates, half buried in snow, were frozen shut, rifles jammed solid, and canteens shattered like glass. War correspondents who were allowed into the area were warned not to photograph certain sectors. The devastation was considered too gruesome for the public. The official reports released to newspapers described it only as a decisive artillery success. But among the soldiers who had walked through it, the phrase carried a darker meaning. Success measured not in territory gained, but in silence achieved. Forensic teams from both sides later studied the craters and shrapnel patterns to understand how the barrage had maintained such precision. They discovered that American gunners had rotated their fire schedules according to acoustic mapping, a primitive but highly effective early form of sound-based targeting. Microphones placed along the front lines triangulated enemy positions, allowing batteries miles away to adjust their range in real time. This technique, developed secretly by the U.S. Signal Corps, had never been used at such scale. Combined with the endless supply of shells from the Red Ball Express, it created a storm that never needed to pause. It was not brute force alone that broke the German line. It was calculation, mathematics, and sound. The few surviving German officers captured and interrogated later described a terror so absolute that words failed them. Major Ernst Langen of the 989th Regiment could only whisper, "It was not war, it was punishment." He spoke of soldiers weeping openly, of men clawing at frozen soil to bury themselves alive. Even in captivity, some flinched at distant thunder, mistaking it for renewed shelling. American doctors noted high levels of psychological trauma among the captives, a condition then referred to as war shock, but what modern medicine now knows as severe post-traumatic stress. When spring thawed the Ardennes months later, farmers began to return to their villages. Beneath the soil, they uncovered layers of twisted iron, melted helmets, and skeletal remains that surfaced each year with the rain. Children were told not to play in the woods. Their elders said the ground still whispered at night. In military museums today, fragments from that battlefield remain on display. Mute pieces of steel that once carried the sound of unending fire, echoing a time when the line between man and machine was buried under 10 days of artillery that refused to stop. Long after the battle ended, American units stationed in Belgium reported strange phenomena in the very woods they had fought to reclaim. Patrols sent through the forest at night claimed to hear distant booms, like phantom artillery rolling through the valleys even though no guns remained. Local civilians called it Donner ohne Blitz, thunder without lightning. For years, the region remained a forbidden zone, scattered with unexploded shells and unmarked graves. Bomb disposal teams worked cautiously, unearthing live ordnance buried deep beneath the soil, their fuses still intact after months in the frost. Each detonation echoed through the forest like a haunting reminder of the days when the ground itself seemed alive. Military historians later reconstructed the timeline of those 10 days with chilling precision. Records from the U.S. 2nd Infantry Division revealed that over 600 guns had been synchronized to fire at intervals so tight that not a single second passed in silence. Ammunition depots were emptied faster than they could be refilled, requiring round-the-clock convoys under blackout conditions. Drivers recalled the eerie glow of the horizon, not from dawn, but from the reflection of fire and explosions that turned night into a trembling blood-red haze. Even miles away, windows in nearby towns rattled continuously for days. Children covered their ears, unable to sleep, while Allied engineers used the sound waves to measure the barrage's range. On the German side, intercepted radio chatter captured the collapse of coherence among frontline units. Officers begged for air support, but Allied control of the skies had made that impossible. One message, transmitted in desperation and cut off mid-sentence, simply read, "No one left to fight. No more ground." Intelligence analysts who reviewed the tape noted the background noise, not voices, not movement, but an endless rhythmic pounding. The artillery barrage was so intense that its sound was picked up through enemy transmissions miles from the front. After the war, the forest was quietly cleared and replanted. No monument was built for the men who vanished there, neither German nor American. For decades, the true scale of the bombardment remained buried in classified archives, overshadowed by larger battles and grander victories. But for those who survived, it never faded. In letters home, artillerymen wrote of the forest that burned without flames, of the silence that followed only after everything human had been consumed. They had seen what it meant when man's machines spoke longer than his prayers, when 10 days of thunder became a hymn of extinction. In the post-war years, the U.S. Army quietly reviewed the lessons of the Ardennes barrage under classified directives. The official term they used was saturation fire doctrine, a theory born not from textbooks, but from the snow-covered graveyards of Belgium. Analysts in Washington called it the perfect storm of modern warfare, a blend of logistics, technology, and endurance that turned artillery into an unstoppable psychological weapon. For every German shell fired during those days, the Americans had answered with 40. It was not strategy, it was arithmetic, a mathematical extermination of resistance. What shocked planners most was not the destruction itself, but how quickly the human mind disintegrated under constant bombardment. Psychologists assigned to post-war studies interviewed dozens of veterans who had endured the storm, both American gunners and captured Germans. The testimonies revealed something hauntingly similar on both sides. Soldiers spoke of losing all sense of time, of living inside the sound. One German corporal described it as a storm without sky, where light and darkness ceased to matter. An American gunner confessed that he no longer remembered loading the shells. His body had moved automatically for hours, maybe days. "We didn't fight them," he said. "We buried them alive." The statement was never included in public reports. In secret meetings at Fort Sill, U.S. artillery officers analyzed the results for future warfare. They concluded that sustained fire could break an enemy's spirit more effectively than any assault. It could strip away organization, communication, and identity until only silence remained. This understanding quietly influenced Cold War doctrines, the notion that psychological collapse could be engineered through pure, continuous pressure. The forest of the Ardennes had become a laboratory of human limitation. While in post-war Germany, the few surviving veterans of the Volksgrenadier Divisions rarely spoke of those 10 days. Those who did described recurring nightmares of endless explosions, of snow that turned to ash, of voices buried beneath the earth. Many could not return to civilian life. In hospitals from Hamburg to Düsseldorf, doctors treated hundreds of former soldiers who trembled at sudden noises or refused to sleep indoors. Officially, the Wehrmacht listed them as mentally unfit. Unofficially, they were known as die Verlorenen, the lost ones. For them, the war had never truly ended. It simply went quiet. By the early 1950s, the full story of the 10-day bombardment had been buried beneath layers of classified documents and sanitized military reports. The official narrative called it a tactical success in the Ardennes counteroffensive, reducing an event of apocalyptic scale to a footnote of logistics. Yet in secret archives marked restricted access, psychological operations, there lay transcripts, intercepted messages, and photographs that told a far darker truth. These documents showed that the U.S. Army had deliberately prolonged the shelling after resistance had already collapsed, not to gain ground, but to measure endurance. It was a grim experiment, a test of how long men could survive inside the unending roar of mechanized destruction. One memo, declassified decades later, contained a chilling line. Sustained fire proved effective beyond expectation. Enemy cohesion destroyed. Further observation recommended. It was signed by a major who later went on to oversee artillery doctrine in Korea. The data gathered from the Ardennes was quietly repurposed, influencing not only future wars, but the evolution of psychological warfare itself. The lesson learned in that frozen forest was simple: to break an army, destroy its mind before its body. In the same period, German investigators working under the newly formed Bundesarchiv began piecing together the fates of the divisions lost in the shelling. What they found were inconsistencies, units that had simply vanished from all communication records, their positions wiped clean. Some mass graves were discovered miles from where they were last reported, suggesting men had fled blindly into the woods before dying of cold or shock. Among the artifacts recovered were half-melted helmets, rosaries, and notebooks filled with fragmented thoughts. One read, "The snow glows at night. We hear the guns even when they stop." Villagers who resettled near Rocherath years later recalled that no birds returned to certain sections of the forest for more than a decade. Trees grew twisted, their roots warped by buried ordnance. During spring rains, the earth would still cough up pieces of shrapnel, each fragment etched with a code and date, a reminder of the precision that had turned this place into a wasteland. For the farmers and loggers who lived nearby, the line between memory and haunting blurred. They said the forest was alive with echoes, that when the wind rose from the east, it carried the low hum of distant thunder, the ghostly rhythm of artillery that once swallowed an entire army whole. By the 1960s, veterans on both sides began to speak cautiously about what had happened in that frozen corner of Belgium. Most of them were old men by then, some living in quiet towns across America, others in war-torn German cities rebuilt from rubble. They described not a battle but a sound, the sound that would never leave them. It began as a memory of artillery, then became something deeper, a vibration that lived inside their bones. Some gunners still woke at night believing the earth was shaking beneath them. In nursing homes from Ohio to Munich, doctors noted the same symptoms: startled reactions to thunder, tremors at sudden noise, eyes that seemed to look past the present. Decades later, they still flinched at fireworks, still saw the white glare of flares falling through snow. Historians attempting to reconstruct those 10 days found it almost impossible to separate fact from trauma. The diaries, the intercepted reports, and even the maps told one story. But the survivors' words told another. One American lieutenant, interviewed in 1964, said he stopped counting the number of shells fired after the first million. "It was like the sky had a heartbeat," he said, "and it wouldn't stop beating until everything down here stopped moving." German survivors, few in number, echoed the same description. To them it was not war. It was erasure, a cleansing by fire and iron. Many refused interviews, saying only, "It's better if it stays buried." In military colleges, the event was rarely mentioned. Officially, it was part of the Battle of the Bulge, a small, necessary victory in the grand struggle against tyranny. Unofficially, it was something else entirely, a moment when technology had crossed an invisible threshold, when war had ceased to be human. Analysts decades later would draw parallels between the Ardennes bombardment and the concept of total warfare, the use of overwhelming continuous force not merely to defeat but to annihilate will itself. The lessons learned there would influence the strategic bombing campaigns in Korea and Vietnam, where the same relentless logic returned under new skies. Yet for those who had walked the snowfields of 1944, no theory or doctrine could explain what they had seen. They had witnessed nature and machinery combine into something unholy. They had stood beneath a sky that refused to rest, where every tree, every breath, and every heartbeat pulsed with artillery. And when the guns finally fell silent, the silence was not peace. It was the sound of a world that had forgotten the difference between victory and destruction. In the decades that followed, the story of those 10 days faded quietly into the margins of history books. The great offensives, the generals, and the victories took center stage, while the forest that burned without fire slipped into silence once more. But beneath the soil of the Ardennes, the past never rested. Each year, farmers still unearthed relics, rusted helmets, shell casings, fragments of bone fused with shrapnel. Children playing in the fields stumbled upon the ghosts of that winter, their innocence intersecting with the remains of a world consumed by madness. Even now, when the snow falls thick across those woods, it covers more than ground. It covers memory itself. The classified reports of Operation Black Snow remained locked away until the early 1990s, when fragments were quietly released under archival declassification laws. What emerged painted a portrait both brilliant and terrible. The 10-day barrage was not chaos, but orchestration, a coldly mathematical feat of logistics, physics, and psychology. Every shell had been timed, every impact predicted. The U.S. Army had, for the first time, created a weapon that targeted not the body, but the soul. Historians called it acoustic annihilation, a phrase that barely captured the horror it inflicted. Yet in the official documents, the language remained clinical. Enemy effectiveness neutralized through sustained fire. Numbers without screams, coordinates without faces. Today, when veterans of the Ardennes still gather, the few who remain, they rarely speak of the shelling. They talk, instead of the silence that followed, the days after, when the wind no longer carried thunder and the snow began to fall clean again. But even in that quiet, they felt something hollow, a sense that the world had crossed a point of no return. They knew what it meant to be erased by sound, to see courage and discipline melt into fear and madness, to stand beneath a sky that had become a weapon. The Ardennes Forest has long since healed. The trees have regrown, the craters softened, and the birds have returned. But beneath the moss and roots, fragments of steel still lie waiting, remnants of the storm that never stopped. The earth remembers what men have chosen to forget. Somewhere, deep below the snow and silence, the last echo of 10 days of fire still trembles faintly, a whisper of thunder that once drowned out the voices of thousands and marked the moment when war itself became eternal noise.